You may not realize it, but much of your silence began long before you learned to use words. He was born there, in childhood, in that moment when his spontaneity met the first crooked look, the first speak down, the first don't do it like that. And without realizing it, you kept pieces of yourself like someone who collects scattered toys before someone complains. But the toys were its authenticity. Many people think that introversion is just a personality trait, but there is a truth that almost no one tells sometimes. It is a silent response to emotional pain, to shame planted early on, when you didn't even know you were wearing a social mask to survive. And behind that mask, there is a sensitive child who just wanted to be seen without judgment. If you feel like you carry too much silence, that you hold words in your throat and emotions in your chest, this video is for you. Here, we will revisit your story not to open wounds, but to show paths of healing, reconnection with yourself and freedom from everything that once held you back. And maybe, just maybe, you'll discover that you've never lacked a voice. Just a safe space to use it. When we think about childhood, we remember that almost sacred freedom, the child who runs, sings, laughs loudly and doesn't have the slightest shame about existing. At this stage, sensitivity is a superpower. Everything is intense, colorful, spontaneous, and the connection with the world happens without fear, without social masks, without any filter that tries to correct your authenticity. It's beautiful to see how they express themselves with their entire bodies, as if each gesture was a reminder that living can be simple. And, deep down, this purity shows something essential. Before any trauma, emotional pain or silencing, there was a true self there, just wanting to be lived, without limits and without asking for permission. Little by little, that same vibrant child begins to reduce the volume of his own soul, as if learning that taking up space can be dangerous. Hesitation arises before laughing. She looks around before speaking. She weighs her words, trying to guess whether she will bother someone, and this care shapes a silent social mask. This silencing does not come all at once. It sets in slowly, almost invisible, like a learned habit. And when sensitivity feels the impact of these small shocks, the fear of being who you really are is born, creating fissures that later appear to be maturity, but in fact hide emotional pain and vulnerability. It's amazing how it's not the big screams that hurt the most, but those little criticisms that seem harmless. A "that doesn't look pretty," a "stop exaggerating," a look of disapproval, all of this plants the seed of shame in the child's heart, who begins to doubt their own authenticity. Over time, these details become deep marks, almost always invisible even to those who caused the emotional pain. Childhood sensitivity absorbs everything, and without realizing it, the child starts to believe that expressing their true self is risky, starting a cycle of withdrawal, protection, and disconnection with themselves. When children realize that their authenticity generates tension, they learn to use silence as a kind of shield. It's not conscious choice, it's emotional survival, a form of protection created to avoid more shame, more fear, more emotional pain that could come from the world around us. Over time, this silence becomes a comfortable, almost automatic armor that prevents vulnerability from appearing. And the worst thing is that, on the outside, it just seems like normal introversion, but inside it's a desperate attempt to stay safe in an environment where being sensitive has become synonymous with risk. Society often sees silencing as a sign of maturity, as if the child who keeps silent has become too adult to express himself freely. But, in fact, this silencing can be disguised emotional damage, a forced adaptation to fit into a mold that does not respect the authenticity of the being. It's sad, but common, to see people confusing this pain with growth. The introversion that arises from this process is labeled as a normal phase, while in reality, it is the reflection of a being who has learned to hide for fear of being judged or rejected, as if being vulnerable was an impossible luxury to afford. That child who once ran free, full of authenticity, slowly gives way to the teenager who walks around corners trying not to attract attention. What seemed like just sensitivity turns into withdrawal, and the fear of being uncomfortable turns into a habit, a silent way of avoiding further emotional pain. Over time, this teenager grows up believing that being discreet is safer, wearing a social mask that fits perfectly but suffocates inside. And so, what was spontaneity becomes deep introversion, not by essence, but as a result of years of silencing and emotional protection. Many people believe that introversion comes out of nowhere, as if it were just a fixed personality trait. But, in many cases, it is born as a direct response to an environment that did not welcome the child's sensitivity, transforming emotional pain and shame into permanent silence. When authentic expression is devalued, children quickly learn that speaking loudly, showing emotions, or asking for connection can create more problems than solutions. Thus, introversion becomes an emotional shelter, a way of protecting oneself and continuing to exist without attracting attention, almost always without realizing that this withdrawal was learned, not chosen. The silence, which began as protection, ends up becoming too heavy to carry alone. He becomes a kind of constant companion, one who prevents conflicts, but also prevents connection, authenticity, and any attempt to show one's vulnerability without fear. And the more a person tries to protect themselves, the more they reinforce the idea that the world is not safe for their sensitivity. Introversion stops being just a trait and becomes a survival mechanism, sustained by years of hidden emotional pain and an almost automatic need to remain invisible. Behind an introvert's silence, there is a constant struggle between the desire to be seen and the fear of being misunderstood. Every unspoken word carries an emotional charge, as if the simple act of speaking was a risk and not a release. This internal war is invisible to others, but it is felt in every moment of withdrawal. Silence, which was initially a defense, becomes an unbearable weight, and the emotional pain of not being completely authentic accumulates, to the point where only the shadows of a stifled identity remain. Healing begins when you realize that there is still that vibrant child within you that never stopped wanting to appear. And, little by little, with emotional security and small acts of courage, you will remove the layers of protection, allowing authenticity to breathe again without fear. This process does not require haste, requires kindness. Reconnection with oneself comes in small steps, like talking a little more, feeling without shame, seeking true connection, and, over time, the sensitivity that was once injured turns into strength, making room for a freer and more whole self. In the end, this whole path of silencing and emotional pain only makes sense when you decide to look inside and ask, what am I still hiding from myself? Maybe the answer comes slowly, maybe it comes with a shock, but it always appears when we give space for authenticity to flourish. Think about what your life would be like if you started, little by little, to take off that social mask that once served as protection. What would change in your relationships? How would your sensitivity express itself if it were not suffocated by fear? And what kind of connection could you create if you allowed your true self to show, without shame and without apology? If this content helped you see something new about your own story, I invite you to continue this journey with me. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep walking with me. We still have a lot to discover together, and each new video can be another open door to your transformation.